I knew something was wrong the moment Alyssa placed the cold plate in front of me at the far end of the long mahogany table. The others were slicing into thick pink steaks that still sizzled on their expensive stoneware, the scent of butter and herbs filling the room. My plate held a piece of meat curled at the edges, gray and stiff, as if it had been rescued from the back of a fridge and microwaved too long. No one looked at me, not even long enough to pretend they cared about my comfort or my presence. I sat there in the draft from the kitchen door as if I were a distant relative who had arrived without warning, not the woman who had once rocked half the people in that room to sleep. I cut into the tough meat slowly, letting the loud, hollow chatter of the dining room drift over me like static. Caleb laughed too loudly at something Alyssa said, that performative corporate laugh he has developed since climbing the ladder at the firm. He used to laugh with his whole chest when he was a boy, throwing his head back in the garden, making me laugh too, no matter how tired I was from the bookkeeping. Now he laughed like someone worried about being overheard by a rival or a superior, even in his own home. "I hope the seasoning isn't too strong for you, Evelyn," Alyssa said without even turning her head to look at me. Her hair was perfect, as always, each strand sprayed into place like a helmet, and she never asked how I actually was during these visits. She only ever asked whether something might inconvenience her or disrupt the flow of her perfectly curated evening. "The seasoning is fine," I answered, though the meat was ice cold and tasted like iron and neglect. I had learned a long time ago that telling the truth to people who don't care is just another way of wasting my remaining breath. Around me, silver forks clinked against china. Voices rose in excitement about vacation homes, and crystal glasses chimed with expensive wine. I sat in the draft because they had pushed an extra chair there at the last minute, right where the cold air hits the floor. There was no proper table setting for me, no linen napkin folded into a swan like the others, just a chair dragged from the hallway. It was as if someone remembered I existed only when the doorbell rang and they realized they needed a body to fill the space. They had planned everything for this dinner so carefully, from the vintage of the wine to the specific cut of the steaks delivered by a caterer. The menu, the seating chart, and the lighting were all orchestrated to project an image of effortless wealth and familial success. Somehow, I was the only part of the entire evening that didn't fit into the aesthetic Alyssa wanted to maintain. It wasn't the first time they had pushed me to the margins, of course, but something about tonight pressed differently on my chest. Maybe it was my age, because 72 feels like a strange and heavy threshold to cross in a house that feels so empty. You are old enough to be invisible to your own children, but not old enough to stop noticing the sting of their indifference. I watched Caleb avoid meeting my eyes for the duration of the main course, as though I carried a question he wasn't prepared to answer. He kept checking his watch, a heavy gold piece I helped him buy 5 years ago, looking for any excuse to move the night along. I chewed the dry piece of meat, letting the silence form around me like a second skin while they talked about renovations. They discussed a new vacation home in Vermont and the upgrades to the private school programs for the children, as if money grew on trees. I knew without needing to ask whose savings had helped make each of those luxury items a reality for them over the years. Money has a way of leaving fingerprints on a life, even when you give it quietly and without asking for a receipt. At one point, my grandson Leo glanced at me from across the table with a soft, flickering look like a light bulb, unsure whether to stay lit. He gave me a tiny, secret smile before Alyssa tapped his arm and directed his attention back to the adult conversation about property taxes. Even children learn where affection is permitted and where it is considered a distraction from the main goals of the family. I finished my plate first because cold food is easy to swallow when you don't actually taste much of anything anymore. No one noticed that I had finished or that I was sitting there with empty hands while they passed the wine around. They were too busy praising Alyssa's perfectly cooked steaks, even though I'd seen the delivery bag in the kitchen earlier. Appearances matter more than the truth in that house, and they always have since Caleb married into that specific social circle. When dessert came, something glossy, expensive, and topped with gold leaf, I wasn't served until the very end of the rotation. I received a sliver thin enough to be symbolic, a mere suggestion of a treat, but I didn't protest or ask for more. I'd spent too many years mistaking my own patience for strength, thinking that being quiet was the same as being a good mother. By the time Caleb walked me to the front door, he was already checking his phone for updates on the markets. Work owned pieces of his attention that I would never be able to reclaim, and he seemed perfectly fine with that trade. "Drive safe, Mom," he said, his eyes never leaving the glowing screen of his smartphone as I stepped out onto the porch. "I always do," I replied, and my voice sounded even to my own ears, quiet, steady, and entirely devoid of the hurt I felt. I walked to the curb where my old sedan waited, patient and unpolished, looking out of place among the luxury SUVs in the driveway. The cold air outside felt kinder and more honest than the manufactured warmth of their dining room and their forced laughter. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, watching the lit windows of their house blink like indifferent eyes. When I finally drove away, I felt a thin crack form inside my heart, the quiet, decisive kind that signals a beginning. The road home was dark and empty, and for the first time in many years, I didn't feel guilty for wanting to be alone. When I got home that night, I didn't turn on the lights, preferring to walk through the dark rooms by memory alone. The house isn't big, but it holds the history of a life lived with care and a husband who actually loved me. I felt the quiet settle into my bones like an old companion as I touched the photographs on the mantel in the dark. Nothing in this small house has ever asked me to be less than I am or to sit in a drafty corner. That is more than I can say for my own son and the woman he chose to build a life with. I sat at my kitchen table and let my hands rest on the worn wood, thinking about all the work they had done. These hands typed numbers for 40 years, carried endless loads of laundry, and held Caleb's feverish head when he was a boy. They signed checks I shouldn't have been asked to sign, covering debts and down payments that were never my responsibility to handle. I raised a son, steadied his steps, and paid for his mistakes even when he stopped looking back to see if I was okay. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow erosion of respect that I allowed to happen because I wanted him to succeed. Caleb was a sweet boy once, but he became a man who believed success meant distancing himself from his origins. His father's death only made the situation worse because grief has a way of hardening people who are already prone to pride. After the funeral, there were bills for the hospital, the legal fees, the mortgage, and the repairs, and I paid every single one. I didn't want him drowning in debt when I still had the breath and the savings to keep his head above the water. He'd married Alyssa by then, and she talked about financial planning with that bright, predatory enthusiasm of people who love spending. I listened to her ideas. I nodded politely, and I wrote the checks she hinted at, but never had the courage to ask for. The first big check was for their down payment, a gift they called a loan but never intended to repay me for. Then came the new furniture because Alyssa insisted a growing family needs a certain level of comfort to be happy. Then a nanny for Leo, then private school tuition, then car repairs, and finally the vacation they swore they'd save for. I covered what I could, and when I couldn't, I found a way to move money around to make sure they were stable. Every Christmas, I told myself that it was a blessing to help my family, even if they forgot to thank me. Every birthday, I reminded myself that children don't owe their parents anything, even though I was starting to feel the strain. It wasn't martyrdom, it was a habit of a mother's instinct to soften her child's path at any personal cost. But over time, the tone of their requests changed from humble gratitude to a cold and biting expectation of my service. What used to be a phone call for advice became a text message with an invoice attached for me to pay. I remember an afternoon when Caleb's voice sounded impatient because an insurance bill hadn't been processed by the bank on time. I paid it that evening without a single comment, though I felt something inside me shift away from him in that moment. It wasn't the money itself that hurt, but the way he handed responsibility to me like I was a hired servant. He was my son, and somehow I had let him believe that my resources and my patience were both bottomless. There were smaller things too, the kind of slights that settle into your memory like dust into the fabric of old curtains. Alyssa would correct the clothes I wore to her parties, making subtle comments about my frugal tastes and my outdated style. She guided conversations away from my life and my history, ensuring that every social interaction centered on her own narrow world. I don't think they meant to cause physical harm, but they simply forgot to look beyond their own immediate needs and desires. I allowed myself to become the shadow in the corner of my own family, a ghost that provided gold and asked for nothing. My grandson Leo was the only exception to this rule of indifference, as he always offered to help with my bags. I thought of Leo as I sat at my table that night, letting the hum of the refrigerator fill the empty kitchen. I wondered what kind of man he would become if he stayed in that house under the influence of Caleb and Alyssa. I wondered whether he'd someday learn to look past the surface of things and see the people who actually sacrifice for him. My eyes drifted to the folder on the counter, the one filled with bank statements I had been ignoring for several months. There were automatic payments for their utilities, their club memberships, and their car notes, all tied directly to my account. I had set them up myself years ago, calling it a mother's comfort to the banker who handled my retirement. A temporary arrangement is what I had called it at the time, but temporary stretches into forever when no one questions it. That night, after the cold leftovers and the empty seat, I realized that I had built a world where I was invisible. I had handed them an open door and then wondered why they kept walking through it without stopping to say hello. There is a fundamental difference between giving to someone you love and disappearing into their shadows to keep them warm. I had crossed that line a long time ago without noticing, and the weight of that realization was heavy on my chest. I stood up slowly, feeling the familiar ache in my knees and the resolve hardening in my mind like iron. I turned off the kitchen light and made my way to the bedroom, carrying thoughts that felt heavier than any groceries. The night was strangely quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath with me while I made my final decision. I couldn't sleep, so I lay in bed staring at the faint cracks in the ceiling that I had memorized over 40 years. It wasn't outrage that kept me awake, because I am far too old and tired for that kind of burning energy. It was something slower and deeper, like the cooling of embers that still burn beneath the gray ash of a fire. Pain doesn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it prefers to whisper because whispers linger much longer in the mind. Around midnight, I finally got up, put on my robe, and walked to the living room to look at the photos. The amber glow of the small lamp spilled over the frames, showing Caleb at 6, covered in mud and grinning at me. There he was at 12, with a science trophy, and there was my husband Thomas, with his hand on the boy's shoulder. I stood there for a long time, feeling the edges of those memories brushing against me like the hands of ghosts. "Where did we go wrong, Tom?" I whispered into the stillness of the room, but the house offered no easy answers. I made a pot of tea, holding the warm cup between my hands and letting the steam rise in soft curls. I had spent so many years believing that giving was the same as loving, and that being loved meant being needed. But I see now that need can be a form of hunger that never bothers to look up and see who is feeding it. Love doesn't grow in soil that is constantly being stripped of its nutrients without any care for the earth itself. I walked into the study where the filing cabinet stood, its drawer sliding out with a tired groan of metal on metal. Inside were the folders of my life, utilities, insurance, taxes, and the thickest one of all, the folder labeled Family. I pulled it out and carried it to the desk, hesitating for only a second before I opened it up. Bills, statements, and receipts from the last decade were stacked inside like sediment in a riverbed, documenting my slow disappearance. Here was the automatic payment for Caleb's second mortgage and the insurance bill for the luxury car Alyssa insisted on driving. Here was the tuition fee for Leo's school, paid early every single month because they were always in a pinch. My name and my signature were repeated on every page like a refrain in a song that had gone on too long. I felt no anger as I looked at the numbers, only a sense of clarity that comes when you stop lying to yourself. "This isn't love," I murmured to the empty room. "This is just a dependence dressed up in the clothes of family." I closed the folder with a click of the latch, a small sound that felt more significant than any shout could be. I sat back in the chair and let my shoulders relax for the first time in years, feeling the guilt wash away. The idea of saying no didn't fill me with the usual dread. It filled me with a strange, steady sense of peace. Maybe I wasn't meant to keep carrying them until I broke under the weight of their expectations and their greed. Maybe caring for them now meant stepping back so they could finally learn how to stand on their own 2 feet. I touched the thin gold ring on my finger, the one Thomas gave me, and remembered his practical advice. "Helen, don't let the people you love forget that you are a person too," he had told me before he passed away. I had forgotten that for a long time, but the cold steak and the drafty chair had reminded me quite clearly. The clock struck 2 a.m, and I breathed in the quiet of the room, letting it settle deep inside me. Tomorrow would not wait for me to be ready, but I felt something taking shape within me that was very firm. It was a steadiness I hadn't used in decades, a cold resolve that felt both foreign and familiar at the same time. I turned off the lamp and walked back to bed, knowing that the morning would bring the first real change. By the time the sun rose, the decision I had made in the dark no longer felt frightening or like a betrayal. It felt calm, as if I had finally stepped into the shape of the woman I was always supposed to be. I rose before the sun and moved through the house while the kettle warmed on the stove for my morning tea. My joints protested the movement, but even that pain felt purposeful today, a reminder of the life I still possessed. I dressed neatly in my slate gray coat, the one Thomas always said made me look capable and strong for the world. I took the family folder from the desk and didn't bother to reread the contents before I headed to the car. The bank opened at 9, but I arrived early, standing under the awning as a light rain began to slick the sidewalks. I breathed in the clean, wet air until the doors unlocked and the familiar scent of paper and carpet cleaner greeted me. I approached the desk and asked for Laura Jennings, the woman who had handled my accounts for over 20 years now. She appeared a few minutes later, soft-spoken and sharp-eyed, and led me into her tidy office with the dying plant. "What brings you in so early, Helen?" she asked, and I placed the heavy folder on her desk without a word. "I need to make some significant changes to all of my accounts," I told her, my voice steady. Laura opened the folder and began scanning the pages, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to genuine concern for my welfare. She noted the automatic payments tied to Caleb and Alyssa's household and asked what I wanted to do with them. "I want to stop all of them immediately," I said, and she didn't blink or try to talk me out of it. "We can suspend them today and remove them entirely once you sign these forms," she explained as she began to type. She told me that some accounts might notify the recipients before the next billing cycle, and I told her that was fine. Her fingers moved across the keys with a sound like rain tapping on a window pane in the afternoon. She asked about the shared credit cards next, and I told her to freeze all 3 of them without any hesitation. She gave a slow, understanding nod and then brought up the authorization Caleb had as a secondary signer on my accounts. "I want it revoked," I said, and this time she paused to ask if I felt safe or pressured by anyone. I almost smiled at the thought that the world assumes an elderly woman making a decision must be in some danger. "No, Laura, I am not being coerced by anyone. I am simply choosing to take my life back while I can." She held my gaze for a moment, then nodded and continued to prepare the documents I needed to sign. For the next 20 minutes, we worked through the paperwork, and I listened as she explained each step of the process. A lifetime of bookkeeping had taught me how to read the fine print, but I let her do her job anyway. When the stack of forms was ready, she handed me the pen and asked one last time if I was sure. I thought of Caleb's face at the dinner table, his eyes sliding past me as if I were a piece of furniture. I thought of Alyssa's fake smile and the cold meat she had served me without a single thought for my dignity. "Yes, I am sure," I said, and my signature flowed onto the paper without a single tremble of my hand. It felt like reclaiming a piece of my soul that I hadn't realized was missing until the pen touched the page. When the last page was signed, Laura gathered the papers and gave me a small, warm smile that felt truly genuine. "You've done something very brave today, Helen," she said, but I just shook my head and stood up to leave her office. "It isn't brave, Laura. It is just necessary if I want to survive the rest of my years with my head high." Outside, the rain had stopped, and the air was cool and fresh as I walked back to my car at my own pace. I wasn't rushing because I wanted to feel the rhythm of my own steps on the pavement for once. I knew that by the time I got home, the ripples of my morning would begin to spread into their world. There would be panicked calls, confusion, and eventually the accusations that I was being cruel or losing my mind to age. But inside me, there was only a steady, deliberate quiet that felt almost like the peace I had been seeking. I drove home slowly, watching the world pass by as if it weren't asking me to hurry up for someone else. The first call came sooner than I expected, the phone vibrating on my kitchen counter before I even took off my coat. It was Alyssa's number, but I let it ring out while I sat down to breathe. I earned the right to take my time, so I ignored the voicemail icon that began to blink on the screen. Then Caleb called, and I watched his name flash, the same name I had once written on his school lunchbox labels. Names don't change, but people certainly do, and he was no longer the boy who needed me to protect him from everything. The phone rang long enough to suggest he was either in a state of panic or a state of extreme irritation. I poured a glass of water and turned the phone face down on the table, letting the silence return to my house. It didn't last long as a text message arrived. "Mom, call me. Something is wrong with the card." I didn't answer the second text either, because a kettle takes its time to boil, and so did the rest of my morning. I moved through the house with a deliberate slowness, finishing the laundry that I had neglected while I was too busy worrying about their needs. Every few minutes, the phone buzzed against the wood of the counter, persistent and annoying as a fly trapped against a window pane. By noon, the tone of the messages had shifted from confusion to a sharp, defensive anger that I recognized all too well from Alyssa. She sent a message saying she was at the pharmacy, and her card was declined while she was trying to pick up her prescriptions. I could almost hear her voice through the screen, tight and offended, as if the entire world had committed a grave administrative error. The pharmacy situation was likely complicated by the recent news regarding the reclassification of certain medications under the new Schedule III drug guidelines. I had seen the reports on the news earlier that morning about how these changes were causing delays and price hikes at the registers. Alyssa was likely already frustrated by the 20-minute wait and the extra paperwork the pharmacist was requiring for her usual refills. To have the transaction fail on top of that bureaucratic mess was probably the ultimate insult to her sense of social standing. I imagined her standing there in her expensive wool coat, refusing to look at the line forming behind her while she argued. She wouldn't even consider that the problem was hers to solve. She would assume the bank had made a mistake. Next came a longer message from Caleb, and this one was filled with the kind of frantic energy that precedes a total collapse of ego. He told me that he had tried 3 different cards at the gas station, and every single one of them had been declined by the system. He mentioned that the mortgage payment for their primary residence had bounced that morning, causing an immediate notification from the lender. The bank had apparently told him they could no longer discuss the specifics of my primary account with him because his authorization had been revoked. He asked if I had changed something, or if I was having some kind of health crisis that affected my memory. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He only asked what I had done to the money. I sat down with a cup of ginger tea and watched the steam rise while I read his words over a second time to make sure I understood. My hand didn't shake as I held the phone, which was a surprise to me given how much I used to fear his disapproval. I had expected to feel a crushing weight of guilt or a desperate need to fix the situation for him as I had always done. Instead, all I felt was a slow, steady certainty that this was exactly what the natural consequences of his actions looked like. He had treated me like a utility company for years, and now the power was finally being cut off for non-payment of respect. I set the phone aside and focused on the warmth of the tea spreading through my chest. The next call was not from Caleb or Alyssa, but from a number I didn't recognize, though I felt a pull of intuition. I answered it on the third ring and heard the thin, worried voice of my grandson Leo on the other end of the line. He sounded small and anxious, a tone that children only get when the adults in their lives are losing control of themselves. He told me that his parents were freaking out and that his father had been yelling at a bank representative on the phone. Leo had left for school, but the tension in the house was so thick that he had been shaking when he got on the bus. I felt a pang of sadness for him, but I knew I couldn't go back on my word. I breathed in and told Leo that I was perfectly fine and that he shouldn't worry about the noise his parents were making. He asked me directly if I had done something to the accounts, and I decided that he deserved the truth rather than a lie. I told him that I had made some changes that were long overdue and that his parents were simply learning how to adjust. There was a long pause on the line, and I could hear him thinking about what that meant for his own comfortable life. He didn't sound angry or shocked, he just sounded thoughtful, as if a piece of a puzzle had finally clicked into place. He told me he noticed I looked unhappy at dinner, and my heart broke for him. Leo thanked me for checking in and hung up, leaving me alone in the silence of my kitchen once again to reflect. It was a relief to know that at least one person in that family was capable of looking at me and seeing a human being. But the peace only lasted 10 minutes before the phone began to ring again, with Caleb's name flashing on the caller ID. I didn't answer it because I knew that any conversation we had right now would be filled with his rage and my defense. Some lessons in life must be learned without a witness or a safety net to catch you when you finally fall. I went back to my chores, focusing on the simple, honest weight of the wet towels I was hanging. By late afternoon, the ripples of my quiet morning had turned into a storm on their end of the county, and I felt it. I could practically sense the panic sharpening with every declined transaction and every automated notice that hit their email inboxes. People reveal their true characters most clearly when their comfort is stripped away and they are forced to look at their reflection. Caleb and Alyssa had built a life on a foundation of my labor and my silence, and now the floor was dropping out. I turned my phone face down again and continued my work, refusing to be the one to bridge the gap. Peace bought with silence is the most expensive thing a woman can ever own, and I was done paying. The messages stopped being questions about the bank and started becoming direct accusations of cruelty and mental instability from Alyssa. She sent a text saying I had humiliated her at the dentist's office because the payment for Leo's cleaning didn't go through. She blamed me for the fact that she had to wait 20 minutes while they checked the system and called the insurance. It was fascinating to see how she viewed her own humiliation as a crime I committed against her person and her status. She never once stopped to think about the years I had paid those bills without ever being thanked or invited for tea. To her, I was just a broken machine that had suddenly stopped dispensing the coins she required. Caleb's next message was more aggressive, telling me that I couldn't just cut them off without warning because they had responsibilities to maintain. He mentioned the children's needs and the various club memberships that were now at risk of being canceled for non-payment. He used the phrase, "I need you to call me now," as if he were still a boss giving an order to a subordinate. I paused on that line for a long time, thinking about how long it had been since he used the word need sincerely. He didn't need me. He needed my credit score and my liquid assets to maintain the lie he was living. I didn't respond because answering him now would only lead me back into the same exhausting cycle of apology. I made another cup of tea and moved to the living room, sitting in the sturdy chair Thomas had bought for me decades ago. It was a queen's throne, he used to joke, and for the first time in a very long time, I actually felt like one. I watched the sky turn a bruised shade of gray as the clouds drifted low over the tops of the bare oak trees. I felt a strange sense of detachment from the chaos I knew was unfolding just a few miles away in their mansion. My world was small, quiet, and entirely paid for by my own hard work and the legacy Thomas left for me. I was no longer willing to set myself on fire just to keep them warm in their luxury. I heard the sound of a car pulling up to the curb outside, and I didn't even need to look to know who it was. I lifted the corner of the curtain and saw Caleb's black SUV idling in front of my house, looking aggressive and out of place. He climbed out of the driver's seat, his jaw set in a hard line, and his phone still pressed tightly to his ear. He was pacing back and forth on the sidewalk, his shoulders hunched as if he were bracing for a physical fight. I saw Alyssa sitting in the passenger seat, her arms crossed over her chest and a look of pure indignation on her face. They were finally here to demand an explanation for the sudden disappearance of their financial safety net. They hadn't knocked on the door yet, likely because Caleb was still trying to get a human being at the bank to talk to him. I watched him gesture sharply with his free hand, his mouth moving in a series of angry, clipped sentences that I couldn't hear. Alyssa pointed at my house and said something to him, her expression darkening when she saw that the lights inside were mostly off. They were still trying to solve the problem with pressure and insistence, believing the world would eventually bow to their collective will. I let the curtain fall back into place and sat back down in the dark, waiting for the inevitable sound of the doorbell. I felt a cold, calm strength radiating from my core that I hadn't felt since Thomas was still alive. A part of me remembered all the nights I had stayed awake, worrying about Caleb when he was just a small, fragile boy. I remembered the fevers that wouldn't break and the nightmares that sent him running into my room at 3 a.m. I would have done anything back then to make his path easier, and I suppose that is where the trouble truly began. I had never stopped trying to protect him, even when he became a man who no longer deserved that level of devotion. I had turned him into a person who didn't know how to suffer even a minor inconvenience without looking for someone to blame. By trying to be a perfect mother, I had inadvertently created a son who was a very poor man. The doorbell finally rang, a sharp and insistent sound that echoed through the empty hallway of my house like a gunshot. I didn't get up immediately, choosing instead to finish my tea and let the silence stretch out for a few more beats. Caleb rang it again, followed by a heavy knock that rattled the wood of the door in its frame. He called out my name, his voice muffled by the heavy oak, but still carrying a note of desperate, demanding authority. I stood up slowly, smoothed my skirt, and walked toward the foyer with the steady gait of a woman who knows her mind. I wasn't afraid of the confrontation, because I had already lived through the worst thing they could do to me. I opened the door just as Caleb was raising his hand to knock a third time, and he nearly stumbled forward into the hall. He looked disheveled, his tie loosened and his hair messy from the wind and the stress of the day's financial failures. He started talking before he was even fully inside the house, his words tumbling over one another in a frantic, angry rush. He demanded to know what was going on with the bank and why his cards had been frozen in front of his colleagues. Alyssa was right behind him, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of weakness or the senility she likely hoped to find. I stepped back and gestured for them to come into the living room, but I didn't offer them any tea. "Mom, you have to fix this right now. The bank won't even talk to me because you revoked my access," Caleb shouted. He paced the length of the rug, his footsteps heavy and disrespectful in a house that used to be a sanctuary for him. Alyssa stood by the fireplace, her hands on her hips, adding that she had been humiliated in front of the neighbors at the pharmacy. They spoke as if I were a naughty child who had made a mess that they now had to clean up. I let them talk for several minutes, watching the way their faces contorted with the effort of trying to bully me. I realized that they didn't see me at all. They only saw the obstacle between them and the money. When Caleb finally stopped to take a breath, the silence that followed was so heavy that it seemed to ring in the ears. I looked at him directly, meeting his eyes for the first time in years, without flinching or looking away to hide my hurt. "I didn't make a mistake, Caleb, and there is nothing for me to fix because I did exactly what I intended to do," I said. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room, cutting through the remnants of his anger like a sharp blade. Alyssa started to interrupt, but I held up my hand, and for the first time in her life, she actually stopped talking. I told them that the era of the open checkbook was officially over as of 9 o'clock this morning. Caleb laughed, that same hollow corporate laugh, as if he thought I was joking or perhaps having a temporary lapse in judgment. He told me that they had bills to pay and that the mortgage was due and that I couldn't just change the rules. I reminded him that the rules had always been mine to set because the money in those accounts belonged to me and Thomas. I pointed out that he was a grown man with a high-paying job and a luxury lifestyle that he should be able to afford. If he couldn't pay his own mortgage without my Social Security and savings, then he was living a lie that I was done subsidizing. His face turned a deep shade of red, and for a moment I thought he might actually scream. "You can't do this. We're your family. We're the only people who look after you," Alyssa hissed, her voice dripping with a false concern. I looked at her and asked when the last time was that she had looked after me without an invoice being involved. I asked her when she had last invited me over for a meal that wasn't a cold afterthought at the end of a long table. She went silent, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to find a lie that sounded convincing. I turned back to Caleb and told him that I had spent 40 years being a mother, but I was done being a servant. I told him that I was reclaiming my name and my dignity starting today. Caleb tried a different tactic then, lowering his voice and trying to sound like the sweet boy he used to be when he wanted a toy. He told me he was under a lot of pressure at work and that he was counting on the Warrior Dividend to clear his debts. He explained that there had been delays with the government processing and that he just needed a few more months of my help. He promised that once the dividend hit his account, he would pay me back every cent with interest and take me on a trip. I looked at him and felt a profound sense of pity because he honestly believed that I would fall for the same empty promise. I told him that hope is not a financial plan and that I wasn't his creditor. The mention of the Warrior Dividend reminded me of how much he had gambled on things he couldn't actually control or predict. He had built a house of cards on the expectation of bonus payments and government handouts while ignoring the mother standing right in front of him. I told him that if he was waiting for a dividend to save his life, then he had already lost the battle for his future. He looked at me then with a flash of genuine hatred, the kind that only comes when a spoiled child is finally told no. He called me selfish and said that I was ruining his life over a few cold pieces of meat at a dinner party. I told him it was never about the meat, it was about the heart behind the service. Alyssa chimed in again, saying that if the bank didn't clear the payments, they would have to sell the vacation home in Vermont. I told her that selling a house they couldn't afford sounded like a very sensible and mature financial decision for them to make. She looked like she wanted to slap me, but she stayed where she was, her expensive jewelry catching the light of the lamp. They were realizing that their threats had no power over me because I no longer cared about their approval or their company. I had lived through 72 years of world changes, and I was not afraid of a few angry words from a disappointed son. I told them that it was time for them to leave my house and go figure out their own lives. Caleb didn't move at first, his eyes darting around the room, as if he were looking for something else to use against my resolve. He brought up Leo, saying that the boy's tuition wouldn't be paid and that I was hurting my own grandson's future with my pettiness. I told him that I had already spoken to Leo and that the boy understood more about character than his father ever would. I also mentioned that if they stopped buying $5,000 watches, they would have plenty of money for the boy's schooling and his books. Caleb's jaw dropped at the mention of the watch, likely wondering how I even knew the price of the things he bought. Bookkeepers always know the price of things, I reminded him with a small, cold smile. They finally realized that there was no more money to be had here, and the transition from pleading to pure venom was instantaneous. Caleb told me that I would die alone in this house, and that he would never bring the children to see me again. I told him that if the only reason they visited was for the checks I signed, then I was already alone, even when they were here. I stood by the door and held it open, the cold night air rushing in to replace the stifling heat of their anger. Alyssa marched out first without a word, her head held high in a fake show of dignity that deceived no one. Caleb followed her, stopping for a second on the porch to look back at me with a face I didn't recognize. "You'll regret this when you need us, Mom," he said, but the words felt hollow even to him as he stepped off the porch. I watched them get back into their luxury SUV, the engine roaring to life with a sound of expensive, wasted power. They drove away into the dark, their taillights disappearing around the corner like two red eyes fading into the night. I closed the door and locked it, the click of the deadbolt sounding like a period at the end of a very long sentence. I walked back into the living room and sat down, letting the quiet of the house wrap around me like a blanket. For the first time in a decade, I felt like I could finally breathe. I looked at the phone on the table and saw that Caleb was now obsessively checking the Powerball results for the December 17th drawing. I knew this because he had accidentally left his tablet synced to the home network I had helped him set up years ago. He was looking for a miracle to save him from the reality of his own poor choices and his inflated sense of ego. It was a sad sight, seeing a man who should have been a leader reduced to praying for a random sequence of numbers. I realized then that I hadn't just saved my own life today. I had given him the only chance he had to become a real man. Whether he took that chance or not was no longer my concern or my burden to carry. I spent the next few hours tidying up the room, feeling a sense of light-footedness that I hadn't experienced since I was a young woman. I wasn't thinking about the money I had saved or the bills that wouldn't be paid by my hand anymore. I was thinking about the fact that tomorrow morning, I could wake up and decide exactly who I wanted to be. I could travel, I could volunteer, or I could simply sit on my porch and watch the world go by without an invoice in my lap. I was no longer a shadow or a ghost. I was Evelyn, and I was finally very much alive and present. I turned off the last light and went to bed, sleeping more soundly than I had in 20 years. The morning after the confrontation brought a silence that felt entirely different from the loneliness I had feared for so many years of my life. I woke up at my usual time, but instead of rushing to check the shared bank portal for overnight charges, I stayed in bed and watched the dust motes dance. I realized that for the first time in a decade, my heart rate didn't spike at the sound of a text notification arriving on my phone. The house felt lighter, as if the heavy presence of Caleb's expectations and Alyssa's demands had finally evaporated into the winter air. I got up and made a simple breakfast of oatmeal and fruit, enjoying the fact that I didn't have to worry about anyone else's preferences. It was a small victory, but after years of being a servant in my own family, it felt like a monumental achievement. Later that morning, I decided to go for a walk through the neighborhood to clear my head and see the world with my newly reclaimed eyes. The air was crisp, and many of my neighbors were out putting up the last of their holiday decorations on their porches and lawns. I saw the mailman making his rounds, and he gave me a friendly wave that I returned with a genuine smile that felt real. I thought about how much energy I had spent hiding the reality of my family situation from the people who lived right next door. I no longer felt the need to pretend that my son was a perfect success or that my daughter-in-law was a saint. There is a profound freedom in allowing the mask of perfection to slip and reveal the messy truth of a human life. When I returned home, I saw that Caleb had sent several emails, each one more desperate than the last, as the reality of his situation set in. He was no longer using the tone of an angry boss. He was now speaking like a man who was watching his entire world crumble. He mentioned that without my support, he wouldn't be able to pay the gardener, the pool service, or the private security firm. It was clear that he had built a life of such extreme overhead that even a minor interruption in cash flow was fatal. I didn't reply because I knew that any word from me would be seen as an opening for more manipulation and pleading. He needed to feel the weight of his own choices if he was ever going to learn how to change them. I spent the afternoon going through my old bookkeeping ledgers, not out of a sense of duty, but to marvel at how much I had survived. I saw the entries from the years when Thomas was sick and how I had managed to keep every ball in the air without dropping one. I saw the first loans I gave to Caleb and how quickly the repayment columns had turned into empty white spaces on the page. It was a ledger of a woman who had given everything away until there was nothing left but a cold steak and a drafty chair. I took a red pen and drew a thick, final line at the bottom of the last page of the family section. That chapter was closed, and I was ready to start a new ledger where the only person I accounted for was myself. The evening news was full of more talk about the Warrior Dividend and how the delays were affecting thousands of families across the country. I watched the reporters interview people who were in tears because they had spent the money before it actually arrived in their bank accounts. It was a sobering reminder of how many people live on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a government miracle to save them. Caleb was just one of many, a man who had traded his character for a chance at a windfall that might never come. I felt a sense of relief that I was no longer the one responsible for catching him when the miracle failed to manifest. I turned off the television and sat in the quiet, grateful for the modest but stable life I had built. A surprise knock at the door around 7 o'clock made me jump, but it wasn't the aggressive pounding of my son or the sharp rap of his wife. I opened it to find Leo standing there, looking awkward in his school jacket and holding a small, crumpled bag from a local bakery. He told me that he had walked from the bus stop because he wanted to see if I was okay after the fight last night. He didn't ask for money, and he didn't try to defend his parents. He just wanted to share a cookie and talk for a bit. I invited him in, and we sat at the kitchen table, the very place where Caleb used to sit when he was a boy. We talked about his school projects and his plans for the future, and I saw a spark of independence in him. Leo told me that his mother was planning to sell some of her designer handbags online to make up for the pharmacy bills she couldn't pay. He said it with a shrug, as if he found the whole situation more interesting than tragic, which gave me hope for his perspective. He seemed to understand that the chaos in his house was a result of choices his parents had made, not a disaster that happened to them. I told him that I was proud of him for being observant and for coming to check on his grandmother, despite the family tension. We finished the cookies, and I drove him back to the end of his street so he wouldn't have to walk in the dark. He thanked me with a hug that felt more valuable than all the checks I had ever signed. As I drove back to my house, I passed the pharmacy where Alyssa had experienced her humiliation the day before during the Schedule 3 drugs crisis. I saw the bright neon signs and the busy parking lot, and I felt a sense of peace, knowing I would never have to pay for her vanity again. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had spent on her wellness supplements and her elective treatments over the last 5 years. All of that money could have been used for my own travels or for charities that actually help people who have nothing. I made a mental note to call the local community center tomorrow to see where I could volunteer my time and my skills. My life was no longer about maintaining a mansion. It was about building a legacy of actual substance. The following days were a blur of small but significant adjustments to my routine as I settled into my new identity as an independent woman. I called a local handyman to fix the leaking faucet in the guest bathroom, a task I had put off because I was busy paying Caleb's bills. He arrived on time, did a wonderful job, and I paid him with a check that didn't feel like a sacrifice or a burden. I realized that I enjoyed the simple transaction of paying for a service and receiving quality work in return without any emotional debt. I started to reorganize my pantry, throwing out the expensive items I only bought to impress Alyssa when she deigned to visit. My shelves were now filled with things I actually liked to eat, and the kitchen felt like mine again. I noticed that Caleb had stopped calling every hour, likely because he realized that his silence was the only thing I was willing to accept. He sent one final message saying that they were listing the Vermont house for sale and that they would be moving Leo to a different school. He tried to make it sound like a tragedy that I had caused, but I knew it was the first step toward their eventual salvation. They were finally beginning to live within their means, even if they were doing it with a great deal of resentment and anger. I hoped that someday they would look back and see that my cruelty was actually the greatest kindness I ever showed them. But even if they never realized it, I was at peace with the outcome of my quiet revolution. By the end of the week, I had joined a local book club and started attending a weekly yoga class for seniors at the community center. I met women who had lived through similar struggles, women who had been the backbone of their families only to be forgotten in their old age. We shared stories and laughter, and I felt a sense of belonging that I had never found at the long, cold table in Caleb's dining room. I was no longer the invisible grandmother. I was Evelyn, the woman who knew how to balance a ledger and how to stand her ground. I felt younger than I had in years, my spirit no longer weighed down by the parasitic needs of people who didn't love me. My house was full of light, and my heart was finally, truly, and completely my own. I took the folder labeled Family and put it in a box in the attic, along with the other relics of a life that was now firmly in the past. I didn't need to look at the bills or the receipts anymore to remind myself of what I had done or what I had lost. The empty spaces in my bank statement were now filled with the names of local businesses, theaters, and travel agencies that I was exploring. I was planning a trip to the coast for the spring, a solo journey that I had dreamed of for years but never felt I could afford. It turned out that when you stop paying for everyone else's life, you have more than enough to fund your own. I sat on my porch and watched the sunset, feeling a deep and lasting sense of quiet satisfaction. Caleb did call one more time, right before Christmas, but his voice was different. It was tired and sounded somewhat humbled by the events of the week. He didn't ask for money, and he didn't accuse me of being insane. He simply asked if they could still come over for a few hours on Christmas Day. I told him they were welcome, but that there would be no expensive gifts this year and that the dinner would be a simple, home-cooked meal. He hesitated for a second, then agreed, saying that Leo really wanted to see me and that they would bring a side dish. I hung up the phone and felt a small, cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, we could start building something real. But regardless of what happened on Christmas, I knew that I would never be invisible again. The holidays arrived with a light dusting of snow that made the neighborhood look like a postcard from a time when things were much simpler. I spent Christmas morning listening to music and preparing a small turkey, enjoying the quiet ritual of cooking for people I actually cared about. When Caleb, Alyssa, and Leo arrived, the tension was still there, but it was buried under a new layer of wary and careful respect. Alyssa didn't comment on my outfit, and Caleb didn't check his phone once during the entire duration of the meal we shared. We sat at my small kitchen table, and while the food wasn't catered or gold-leafed, it was warm and it was enough for all of us. I looked at their faces and saw the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward their own maturity. After they left, I sat by the fireplace and watched the embers glow, thinking about the year that was coming to an end and the one starting. I had survived a reckoning, a night of cold steak that had led to a morning of absolute and life-changing clarity for me. I had lost the illusion of a perfect family, but I had gained the reality of a life lived on my own terms and with my own money. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, and that Caleb and Alyssa might still try to slip back into their old ways. But I was ready for them now, armed with the knowledge that my value was not tied to the checks I could sign. I was Evelyn, and for the first time in 72 years, I was finally, wonderfully, and completely free. The days following the holiday visit were perhaps the most revealing of all, as the initial shock of the transition began to settle into a permanent reality. I spent my mornings organizing my financial life with a precision that brought me a deep sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. I sat at my desk with my bank statements, no longer dreading the sight of the rows of automated deductions that used to drain my savings. Instead, I saw a steady balance that reflected my own needs, allowing me to plan for a future that belonged entirely to me. I realized that my previous fear of being alone was nothing compared to the exhaustion of being used by the people I loved. Now, the silence in my house was a choice, rather than a symptom of neglect, and I cherished every quiet moment. I received a formal letter in the mail from the bank, confirming that all secondary access to my primary accounts had been successfully and permanently revoked. The letter was cold and bureaucratic, but to me, it felt like a certificate of graduation from a school of hard knocks that I had attended for too long. I placed the document in my safe, knowing that Caleb had likely received a similar notification that officially ended his legal claim to my resources. I felt a slight twinge of sadness for the boy he used to be, but it was quickly overshadowed by the respect I now had for the woman I had become. I was no longer a victim of my own generosity, but a guardian of my own hard-earned legacy and peace of mind. By the middle of January, the national news regarding the Warrior Dividend had taken a darker turn as the promised payments continued to face significant administrative hurdles. I watched a segment on the evening news about families in Connecticut who were facing foreclosure because they had leveraged their entire lives on that single expectation. It made me think of Caleb and the desperate way he had paced my living room, begging for just a few more months of my financial life support. I realized that by cutting him off when I did, I had forced him to face the reality of his situation before it became a total and irreversible catastrophe. My decision hadn't just saved my own retirement. It had potentially saved him from a much deeper level of ruin. I decided to take a trip to the local library to research some historical bookkeeping methods, a hobby that allowed me to reconnect with my professional roots. While I was there, I saw a group of young people discussing the recent changes in Schedule III drugs and the impact on local healthcare costs. I sat at a nearby table and listened to their direct, unsentimental assessment of the situation, and it reminded me of how the world keeps moving forward. I realized that I didn't have to be an expert on every new regulation to understand the fundamental truth of how money and power work. I felt a sense of connection to the younger generation, a feeling of being part of the living world rather than a relic of the past. A few days later, I saw a post on social media that Caleb had shared, though I didn't engage with it or leave a comment of my own. He had posted a photo of the for sale sign in front of their vacation home in Vermont, accompanied by a caption about new beginnings and simplifying life. It was a sanitized corporate way of admitting defeat, but it was an admission nonetheless, and I was glad to see him taking some form of public responsibility. Alyssa didn't appear in the photo, and I wondered how she was adjusting to the loss of the status she had worked so hard to project. I felt no joy in their struggle, but I felt a profound sense of relief that I was no longer the one paying for their illusions. I finally made the decision to book that trip to the coast I'd been thinking about, choosing a small, quiet inn that looked out over the Atlantic Ocean. I didn't ask anyone for permission, and I didn't check to see if the dates interfered with anyone else's schedule or expectations. I simply entered my credit card information, my own card, tied to my own account, and felt a rush of adrenaline as the confirmation appeared on the screen. I spent the afternoon packing a small suitcase with the clothes I liked, not the ones Alyssa thought were appropriate for a woman of my age. I felt like a girl again, standing on the edge of an adventure that was entirely of my own making and my own funding. Leo called me on a Tuesday evening to tell me that his parents had finally stopped fighting about the bank and started talking about a budget. He sounded relieved, his voice lacking the sharp edge of anxiety that had been there during our last few conversations in the heat of the crisis. He told me that he was actually looking forward to the move to a smaller school because it was closer to his friends and less focused on social standing. I realized that the collapse of Caleb's house of cards was actually the best thing that could have happened to my grandson's emotional development. He was learning that value is found in relationships and character, not in the size of a house or the brand of a watch. I spent my last night before the trip sitting on my porch, even though the air was cold enough to make my breath visible in the moonlight. I looked at the neighborhood and felt a sense of belonging that was rooted in my own presence, not in what I could provide for others. I thought about the cold steak and the drafty chair, and I realized that those insults were the catalysts that had pushed me toward my freedom. Without that final, bitter reminder of my invisibility, I might have spent the rest of my life as a ghost in someone else's mansion. I went inside and locked the door, feeling the warmth of my house wrap around me like a well-deserved embrace from an old friend. The drive to the coast was long and quiet, giving me plenty of time to reflect on the journey I had taken over the last few weeks. I watched the landscape change from the familiar suburbs to the rugged, salt-sprayed beauty of the shoreline, feeling my spirit expand with every mile. I checked into the inn and was greeted by a woman who looked to be about my age, her face lined with the stories of her own lived experiences. She handed me the key to my room and told me that the breakfast was served at 8, but that I was welcome to stay in bed as long as I liked. I thanked her and walked up the stairs, feeling the weight of the past decade finally lifting from my tired shoulders. I spent the next 3 days walking along the beach, watching the waves crash against the rocks with a relentless, honest power that I deeply admired. I saw a few people checking their phones for the latest Powerball results, their faces tight with the same desperate hope I had seen in Caleb's eyes. I felt a deep sense of gratitude that I no longer needed a lottery win to feel secure or happy in my own skin. My wealth was not in the bank, though that was stable now. My wealth was in the fact that I knew exactly who I was and what I stood for. I sat on a piece of driftwood and wrote a letter to myself, documenting the promises I was making for the rest of my life. I returned home, feeling refreshed and more capable than I had felt in 30 years, ready to face whatever the next chapter of my life might bring. I found a small package on my porch from Caleb, and when I opened it, I found a framed photo of him, Leo, and me from a decade ago. There was a short note tucked inside that simply said, "Thank you for being a mother," without any mention of money or bills or the bank. It was the first honest communication I had received from him in a very long time, and I felt a small, warm tear prick at the corner of my eye. I placed the photo on my mantle, next to the one of Thomas, and felt the family circle begin to heal in a new way. I started my volunteer work at the community center the following Monday, helping other seniors navigate the complexities of modern financial systems. I realized that my years of bookkeeping were a gift that I could use to help people who were being overwhelmed by the same world that had tried to swallow me. I met a woman named Martha who was struggling with the same Schedule III drug costs that had caused Alyssa so much public humiliation. We sat together and worked through her budget, and when we finished, she gave me a smile that was worth more than any corporate bonus I could imagine. I was no longer just a provider of funds, I was a provider of clarity, strength, and genuine human connection. Caleb and Alyssa officially moved into their smaller house at the end of the month, a process that Leo described as exhausting but kind of fun. They had to sell most of their designer furniture and high-end appliances, forcing them to look at what they actually needed to survive as a family unit. Caleb called me to ask if I had any old pots and pans I wasn't using, a request that was so humble it almost made me want to write him a check. Instead, I gave him the extra set I had in the attic, along with a recipe for the simple stew that Thomas used to love so much. He thanked me sincerely, and for the first time, I felt like he was actually hearing my voice. The winter began to fade into a cold, wet spring, and with it came a sense of renewal that permeated every corner of my small, tidy home. I spent my afternoons working in the garden, preparing the soil for the flowers I planned to plant once the ground was fully thawed. I thought about the cycle of growth and decay, and how sometimes a plant needs to be pruned heavily to survive the winter and bloom again. I was the one who had done the pruning this year, and while it had been painful for everyone involved, the results were starting to show. My son was becoming a man, my grandson was becoming an adult, and I was finally becoming myself after years of being a shadow. I went to a book club meeting on a Thursday evening and found myself laughing so hard that my sides actually ached for several hours afterward. We were discussing a story about a woman who traveled the world alone, and I realized that I wasn't the only one who had felt the urge to break free. I looked around the room at the diverse faces of the women there and felt a profound sense of sisterhood that I had never known. We weren't there because of our husbands' jobs or our children's schools. We were there because we enjoyed each other's minds and company. It was a simple, honest pleasure that didn't cost a single cent, but felt like the ultimate luxury to my soul. The news about the Warrior Dividend eventually faded from the headlines as the government found a way to distribute the funds more equitably over a longer period. Caleb received a small portion of what he had expected, enough to cover his moving costs, but not enough to restore his previous life of unearned luxury. He told me about it with a shrug, saying that it was better than nothing, but that he wasn't counting on it to solve his problems anymore. It was the most mature thing I had ever heard him say, and I felt a surge of maternal pride that had nothing to do with his professional success. He was finally learning to value the work of his own hands and the reality of his own bank balance. I took Leo to the movies on a Saturday afternoon, and we sat in the dark eating popcorn and laughing at the absurdities on the glowing screen. He told me that he was proud of me for standing up for yourself, and that he hoped he could be as strong as I was when he grew up. I told him that strength isn't about how much you can carry, but about knowing when it's time to put the burden down and walk away. He nodded as if he understood perfectly, and I realized that the lessons I had learned in my 70s were being passed down to the next generation. I wasn't just saving my own life, I was providing a map for his, and that was the greatest gift of all. I spent an afternoon at the bank with Laura Jennings, not to change anything, but to thank her for her professional support during my most difficult week. She was happy to see me looking so well and told me that she had seen a lot of women in my position who never found the courage to act. We talked about the importance of financial literacy for women of all ages, and I told her about my volunteer work at the community center. She offered to come and give a guest lecture, an idea that I immediately accepted with a great deal of enthusiasm and excitement. My professional life was finding a new purpose, one that was rooted in service rather than just the cold accumulation of numbers. As the flowers began to bloom in my garden, I realized that the thin crack I had felt inside my heart months ago had actually been a seed breaking open. What I had thought was the beginning of the end was actually the beginning of a vibrant and beautiful new way of existing in the world. I no longer felt the need to look back at the years of neglect or the cold steak that had been served to me in that drafty room. Those things were just the husks of an old life that I had finally outgrown, and I was grateful for the lessons they had taught me. I sat on my porch and watched the spring rain wash away the last of the winter's grime. I received an invitation to dinner at Caleb and Alyssa's new, smaller house, and this time the tone of the request was one of genuine invitation rather than obligation. I accepted, and when I arrived, I found a house that was cluttered with the evidence of a real life being lived rather than a museum of status. Alyssa was in the kitchen, her hair a bit messy and her apron stained, but she gave me a smile that didn't feel manufactured or fake. We sat at a table that was a bit too small for all of us, but no one was sitting in a draft or eating cold leftovers. We shared a simple pasta dish, and the conversation was about things that actually mattered to our daily lives. During the meal, Caleb mentioned that he had started a side project to help veterans navigate the complexities of government bonus systems, inspired by his own struggle. He said he wanted to make sure that other people didn't make the same mistakes he had made by counting on money that hadn't arrived yet. I looked at him and saw the man I had always hoped he would become, someone who used his skills to help others rather than just to enrich himself. I felt a sense of completion, as if the ledger of our relationship had finally been balanced after decades of being in the red. I was no longer his crutch, I was his mother, and he was finally my son in every sense. I drove home that night under a clear sky full of stars, feeling a sense of peace that was so deep it felt like a physical weight in my chest. I thought about the 72 years it had taken me to get to this point, and I realized that every single moment had been necessary for my growth. I didn't regret the giving, and I didn't regret the stopping. I only regretted the time I had spent believing that I wasn't enough on my own. I walked into my house and didn't turn on the lights, enjoying the familiar shadows and the soft, steady ticking of the clock in the hall. I was Evelyn, and I was home, and the world was exactly as it should be. The next morning, I woke up and realized that I had reached my 100th day of independence, a milestone that I decided to celebrate with a long walk by the river. I saw the water flowing steadily toward the sea, a constant and powerful reminder of the way life keeps moving regardless of our personal struggles. I thought about the people I had helped at the community center and the friends I had made in the book club and the yoga class. My life was full, rich, and entirely of my own making, a tapestry of experiences that I had woven with my own hands. I felt a sense of immense gratitude for the courage I had found in the middle of a cold December night. I sat on a bench by the water and watched a group of children playing nearby, their laughter echoing off the stone walls of the old bridge. I thought about Leo and the man he would become, and I knew that he would be okay because he had seen what it looks like to be strong. I pulled a small notebook from my pocket and started to write down the plans for my next trip, a journey to the mountains in the fall. I wasn't running away from anything anymore. I was running toward the rest of my life with my eyes wide open and my heart full. The world was big, beautiful, and full of possibilities, and I was finally ready to explore every single one of them. I walked back to my car, my steps light and my mind clear, ready to go home and start the work of another beautiful, ordinary day. I knew that there would still be challenges, and that life would always find a way to surprise me. But I was no longer afraid of the future. I had my own money, my own house, and most importantly, I had my own self, and that was more than enough for anyone to have. I turned the key in the ignition and listened to the engine hum, a steady and reliable sound that matched the rhythm of my own heart. I drove away from the river, heading toward the life I had claimed for myself, finally and forever free.